Hello, friends. Happy Sabbath. Excited for another musing today. This one is going to be an interesting topic. I first came across this perspective, I think it's been a decade. Rock Waterman had an old blog, I think, called Pure Mormonism, where he had an article about this, and that was the first time I had encountered some of these ideas. I've researched them and thought about them a lot since then. And it's this topic of what is tithing actually? Now, those of you who have listened to any of these musings know that I really like to understand context, how certain revelations came about, what the meaning of words was at the time the revelation, any particular revelation was given. Let's not bring our kind of modern interpretation and the traditions of our fathers to these revelations. Let's actually try and understand what did they mean at the time. And if they've changed, let's talk about that. Did they change through revelation, just through traditions of our fathers and so forth? And my heavens, tithing, I think, is one of those topics that there's a lot of, shall we generously say, misunderstanding about what the law of tithing actually is. And so I'm excited to unpack some of this today. I feel a little bit like I hear a lot from my attorney friends. So I have a lot of friends who, over the years, different colleges, they've all studied constitutional law. And what I have consistently heard from attorneys that study constitutional law is that an extremely common practice and consistent practice in these law schools is that when you're studying constitutional law, you don't actually get around to reading the Constitution. You would think in a course designed to teach students about constitutional law that they would read from the originating text itself. Not so. What do they focus on? They focus on case law. They focus on what lawyers in black robes that we call judges have said about the Constitution, right? The kind of prevailing interpretations, the kind of ruling decrees about what they claim is or is not constitutional. But these wannabe attorneys, these students, are never actually reading or being required to read and focus on the underlying text. And as I think about that, certainly there's religious implications for that too. I think of, in Judaism, all the rabbinical interpretations, how the Pharisees would rank and prioritize all the different commandments, and they came up with like 600 of them, and they had this complicated, and so Jesus comes in and blows all that away and says it's all about love. Knock this off. You're nitpicking at things. This is ridiculous. And yet that was the kind of practice of the religious leaders of the time, was to encumber the underlying commandments and revelations with all these man-made kind of interpretations and adding all this like layered stuff on top. So then with tithing, what are we told today? What is the case law of tithing? And then what is the kind of the constitutional or originating text? Well, we're being told all kinds of things that, every primary kid learns, and we've all, heard countless times. You hear things like this from Elder Bednar. I promise that as you and I observe and keep the law of tithing, the windows of heaven will be opened, and spiritual and temporal blessings will be poured out, such that there shall not be room enough to receive them. That's a pretty common one, right? The carrot being dangled in front for compliance with the law of tithing. It's this promise of blessings. God will pour out this abundance that you won't even have room to contain it, type of thing, right? So we hear that a lot about tithing, about this promise of almost like an ROI, right? For every $1 you put in, you'll get at least $1 out, this kind of transactional implication of temporal blessings. We hear things like this from Elder Hales, that tithing implies freely giving 1/10 of our income annually. That's going to be a large part of our discussion today, is what does that actually mean, right? But that's common. We hear that, 1/10 of your income. So this is kind of the case law, if you will, of what people are saying about the law of tithing. 1/10 of your income annually. We hear this from the First Presidency in 1970. I believe most of this still is in the handbook, the church handbook that leaders use. Quote, "The simplest statement we know of is the statement of the Lord himself, namely that the members of the church should pay, quote, 1/10 of their interest annually, end quote. They were quoting the scriptures, but here they continue with their statement. 1/10 of all of their interest annually, and then the First Presidency continues by saying, which is understood to mean income. No one is justified in making any other statement than this. Well, at the risk of making a statement in this musing, here we go, we're going to continue, right? But they say the scripture says 1/10 of all their interest annually, which is understood to mean income. Again, like Elder Hales, right? 1/10 of all of our income annually. These are the things we hear about the law of tithing. These are the interpretations, I don't want to call them Pharisaical, but the kind of man-made, sayings on top of what the text actually says. And so much of the debate that you hear about tithing, or about the interpretation of tithing, really rests around gross versus net. I mean, that's like the whole debate. Should I be paying tithing on all the money I earn, or my net earnings, like after taxes, basically, right? And that's the extent of the debate, to the extent there is any debate in the church about tithing. And to their credit, church leaders consistently say that's between you and the Lord, right? Because the Lord knows your circumstances and we don't. And this is all the Lord has said, 1/10 of your interest, which means income. So how you interpret that is up to you. Now, as we should actually try and focus on what that law is. And before we read that law, a bit of context is important. Because again, if we want to understand why a revelation was given or what it says, we should try and understand what was happening at the time. Well, what was happening at the time was the saints were required to obey the law of consecration. And they were really struggling to do so. The church had made some unsuccessful business decisions and banking ventures. A lot of members were covetous. They were having a hard time living up to this idea and surrendering property. There were a lot of national economic problems at the time, right, that were affecting the bank and the investments from the church and the church individual members of the church, their own economic position. And so the church is struggling. This newfound church is trying to get its financial footing. And by God, the church has been commanded to do a bunch of different things. And so leaders of the church are trying to figure out, how do we do this? How do we financially support the institution where God has commanded us to do all this stuff? We need money. We need resources to do what God is saying. So this leads Bishop Partridge in 1837. He consults with his first counselor and the manager of the local storehouse in Missouri. And so in 1837, Bishop Partridge suggests that every household donate 2% of its net worth each year. Because here they're consecrating things, right? They're giving of their property and they're apportioning it out, and all these immigrants are coming and they're trying to figure out how to have all things in common and how to distribute property, and they're trying to live this united order type of thing, and it's struggling, and church leaders are struggling to figure out how this happens. So shortly thereafter, Joseph, in a meeting, basically prompts a question, or asks a question that prompts a revelation. So this is July 8th of 1838. Joseph says, O Lord, show unto thy servants how much thou requirest of the properties of thy people for a tithing. So church members understood a tithing was required. Of course, it's in the scriptures, and generally speaking, tithing means kind of a 10% type of thing, right? Like the word itself implies a tenth, a tithe. And so, but the church members had different understandings of it, and there's various levels of enforcement and all this kinds of stuff, right? So Joseph's trying to figure out, how do we do this tithing thing? Because now we got this law of consecration. God isn't just calling on us to give, 10%, however we define that, and then move on with our lives. He wants consecration, right? All eyes single to his glory, building up Zion, and this economic system designed to sustain that model. So he asks this question, right? Show unto thy servants how much thou requirest of the properties of thy people for a tithing. Because tithing at the time was more understood to be an offering, a voluntary offering, not necessarily 10%. It was just this concept of a voluntary offering. And so Joseph gets, in response to this question, the revelation that's now in Doctrine and Covenants 119. And that is the law of tithing. That is the quote-unquote constitutional text that it seems like few people read, that we're just focused on the case law, the interpretations, all the layers of interpretation on top of what tithing is or isn't, without referring to the actual text. But what's important to note, and we'll talk about this, let's talk about it now. It's often implied that tithing is a lesser law, right? The story goes that the saints were trying to live the law of consecration and they failed, so God took away that law and gave us the law of tithing instead. Almost like, Melchizedek priesthood. Moses is coming down the mountain. He sees the children of Israel, all idolatrous. Moses throws the tablets down, goes back up the mountain, and brings down the lesser law. And that's what the children of Israel had, the Aaronic priesthood. So it's kind of with that same level of, that same angle that the church often talks about tithing. In fact, in the heading of D&C 119, this confusion is introduced institutionally there. So they've got this big paragraph at the beginning of 119, and it says, I'm looking in the manual and not in the actual scriptures. Let me pull that up. Bear with me. So D&C 119, and this isn't a long revelation, but in the little section heading at the beginning, it says this: the Lord had previously given to the church the law of consecration and stewardship of property, which members, chiefly the leading elders, entered into by a covenant that was to be everlasting. Because of failure on the part of many to abide by this covenant, the Lord withdrew it for a time and gave instead the law of tithing to the whole church. So that context, or that kind of summary, is implying that we tried consecration, it didn't work, God stopped it, and instead, it says, gave instead the law of tithing to the whole church. I believe that section heading is inaccurate, because as you get into the verses themselves, that's not quite the picture that is painted. I think of, President Hinckley talked about years ago, he said, consecration is, quote, still in effect. And anyone who's been to the temple knows this, right? Consecration did not go away. In certain circumstances, we still commit to live the law of consecration. D&C 42 that talks about consecration has never been repealed. To my knowledge, there's no subsequent revelation that undercuts 42 that says, just kidding, we're not requiring saints to consecrate anymore. Now, there was kind of a parallel issue of the United Order. And so in D&C 104, that covenant was broken. That was made void. The United Order was effectively dismantled. And D&C 104 talks about this, chiefly because of the implementation by the leaders of the church that are trying to kind of implement this economic model. But the underlying and kind of parallel or separate commandment to consecrate did not go away. I don't see anywhere in the scriptures where it goes away. President Hinckley affirmed that it hasn't. I'm sure other leaders have that I haven't found their statements, but my own temple experience reiterates this, as does yours, I assume. And so then I think this section is wrong to say consecration went away and we were given tithing as a lesser law. Why do I think that? Look at verses 1 and 2. Let's actually dig into 119. Again, it's not long. Verily, thus saith the Lord, I require all their surplus property to be put into the hands of the bishop of my church in Zion, for the building of mine house, and for the laying of the foundation of Zion, for the priesthood, and for the debts of the presidency of my church. Here is the law of tithing. We'll read the other verses in just a moment. This is the law of tithing. This whole section is about the law of tithing. Verse 1, I require all their surplus property to be put, almost identical language to what we see in D&C 42. This is consecration language. Bring your surplus. This is consecration. And so my reading of this is that D&C 119 is being given within the framework of consecration. The saints are struggling to kind of figure out how to consecrate and how to tithe, and they're not quite sure what's going on. And Bishop Barter just saying, let's do a 2% annual tithe on net worth. And then Joseph is like, can you clarify this? Because there's some confusion. And here the Lord is saying, well, here's your law of tithing. You start with giving your surplus to the bishop of the church. And then let's continue. Verse 3, this shall be the beginning of the tithing of my people. And after that, and that's important for reasons we'll mention in a moment, after that, those who have thus been tithed, so here it's saying that that surplus is a tithe. You're giving your surplus, but then here it says that is a tithe, so not 10%. You give your surplus, and after you've thus been tithed, you shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually. We'll talk about that. And this shall be a standing law unto them forever, for my holy priesthood, saith the Lord. Verily I say unto you, it shall come to pass that all those who gather unto the land of Zion shall be tithed. So this is the immigrants that are coming, right? All the people that are moving to Zion from the missionary work. They shall be tithed of their surplus properties, and shall observe this law, or they shall not be found worthy to abide among you. 2 more verses. And I say unto you, if my people observe not this law to keep it holy, and by this law sanctify the land of Zion unto me, that my statutes and my judgments may be kept thereon, that it may be most holy, behold, verily I say unto you, it shall not be a land of Zion unto you. And this shall be an ensample unto all the stakes of Zion, even so, amen. All right, a few observations, and then we'll unpack this a bit to get to why I think 99.9% of us are doing tithing wrong. So a few observations. First, there's no blessings in here. There's kind of a curse, if you will, right? If you don't do this, you won't have Zion. If the new people coming to the church don't, give their surplus, they can't be counted as part of Zion. They won't be, specifically says they shall not be found worthy to abide among you if they don't do their initial consecration of surplus property. So that's interesting. We often think of tithing in the context of Malachi, and this is where Elder Bednar and so many others are like, blessings and God will pour them out and all these amazing things will happen and the ROI on your tithing investment will be amazing, right? And that's kind of the flowery carrot dangling, like pay your tithing because good things will happen to you. But here's God's law of tithing, and there's no mention of blessings attached to it. In part, I think, because this is not stated as a commandment. It's given as a law. And I think in the Venn diagram between commandment and law, there's a lot of overlap, but I don't think they're perfectly synonymous. Even if you look at the root of the word commandment, right? Like there's a demand versus a command and this kind of joint, a dictator kind of demanding something of you versus someone like God commanding you, but God is there with you to like help you in that thing type of deal, right? Commandment to love one another. We understand how and why, and we don't need a detailed checklist. And Joseph doesn't need to pray and say, how do we love one another, right? These commandments are more like implicitly understood, I feel like, versus a law of the church, a rule, a regulation is kind of like, let me spell this out of how this is going to go. And it's almost like membership rules, right? Like for the handbook, it's like if you want to be a member in good standing of our organization, here are the laws, the church laws. Any organization can set these laws up. Here are the church's laws. It's a law of tithing. So it's not necessarily a commandment. Does that mean we don't have to do it? Well, no, it's a law. If we want to be members of God's church, we have to tithe. But it's different and distinct than a commandment. So that's another observation. The consecration at the outset of the law of tithing is another observation I had. We already talked about that. The word interest, which we'll get into, interest versus income. What does that mean? 1/10 of our interest annually. I also found it interesting. Verse 4, this shall be a standing law unto them forever. That doesn't sound like a lesser law to me that's going to get wiped away when we finally wise up and can start consecrating as a church again, right? Consecration didn't go away. Those of us aspiring for spiritual greatness and going through the temple and all the rest, like we're supposed to be doing this. D&C 42 requires us already to do it. Again, to my knowledge and in my reading, I can't find anywhere where it's like, just kidding, you don't need to do that. Just pay your tithing and you're good for now. There have been leaders of the church that have said this aspirational or forward-looking statements like one day when we're required to consecrate again. I don't think that quite hits the mark because I believe those obligations already exist. And so here this is saying this law of tithing is a standing law unto us forever. That's interesting. Mentioned the new members coming to Zion, having to be tithed on their surplus. That's interesting as well. Okay, so tithing is mentioned elsewhere in the scriptures. like it's fire insurance. So it says, we won't be burned at his coming if we tithe. And that's in 64:23. Tithing funds being used to build the temple. So there's various references to tithing, but here is where the Lord defines tithing. If you and I want to understand what is expected of us to be in good standing with the church, if we want to follow the Constitution, we should look at the text and not rely on the case law of so many interpretations and this theocratic telephone game, right? You remember playing that where you start with a message and then the next person says it to the next person, and generations later, we've got a totally warped understanding because no one's reading D&C 119 and focusing on what the actual text necessarily says. So let's start with surplus, right? Verse 1, I, God, require all their surplus property to be put in the hands of the bishop of my church. To me, this sounds like a one-time action, right? Both because in verse 5, it says when people newly come to Zion, they have to give their surplus property. And then presumably when this law was given, when people are, baptized into the church, they give their surplus property. So this part, I believe, is a one-time action, kind of when you first come into the fold. And again, this is consecration language right out of D&C 42. And if you go to the 1828 Webster Dictionary, which is essential, especially on a topic like this, but generally speaking, to understand, early Restoration era scripture, we need to understand how words were implied and utilized at the time that they were said. Words have changed meaning, right? Definitions have morphed. And so we need to go back, and that's where you can find it online. I have that's right there. I have a big, thick green one, the printed version, but you can find it online. You just search 1828 dictionary and you'll find it. You can look up any word. So as you're doing your scripture study, you get to a word you don't know, look it up there, pretty handy. So let's look up surplus. When God says, I require all their surplus property, what does that mean? Here's the 1828 definition of surplus. Overplus. Okay, well, kind of, we don't really use that word anymore, but it meant excess, right? Overplus, that which remains when use is satisfied. Excess beyond what is prescribed or wanted. So all God is saying here in verse 1 is when you come to the church, when God newly gave this law of tithing commandment and clarified it for everyone, he's saying to all the members of the church, everything you have left over after what you need or even want, because part of this definition is excess beyond what is wanted, right? Take care of yourself, right? Whatever you have for your family. But if you have all this excess, if you have far and away, more than what you need, that is the excess that you're supposed to bring to the church. It is not this consecration of everything I've ever bought and owned, and here you go, have it all. I'm now poor and I can't take care of my family. It's not that at all. Quite the opposite. Take care of your family, and then what you have as a surplus, you can bring to the church, to the storehouse. Okay, so that is the definition of surplus. That definition is frankly the same today, right? When we think of surplus, I don't think this is shocking to anyone. John Corrill was tasked by Joseph with doing an early history of the church. And so you can find this actually in the Joseph Smith papers, I believe in volume 2. So in 1839, here's this scribe kind of talking about the early history. And John says, the law requires a consecration of the overplus, again, kind of like surplus, after reserving for himself and family to carry on his business. No one's talking here about giving away the stuff you actually need to survive and manage the affairs of your home and your business. It's everything else on top of that. This is really important for reasons we'll touch on just a little bit later. And so as I think about this, I remember the stories of Abraham, right? Everyone would talk about how Abraham would go to Melchizedek, the Prince of Peace, the King of Peace, and Abraham paid tithes unto him. So we should too. And that's kind of how that scripture story goes. Well, what's interesting is when you look at Genesis 14, where this story exists, it's very scant, the part it just says, and he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, and he gave him tithes of all, period. Okay, so, Abraham had a ton of stuff, right? And so he gave him tithes of all. Did Abraham pay 1/10 on his net worth, on all his property? Tithes of all, period. That's all it says. However, the Joseph Smith translation is really interesting here. So Joseph Smith translation of Genesis 14, it creates a lot more content in there of what was going on. And so this verse 20 becomes verse 39 in the translated version. And it says this: "Wherefore Abraham paid unto him," Melchizedek, "tithes of all that he had, of all the riches which he possessed, which God had given him more than that which he had need." Abraham paid unto him tithes of all that he had, of all the riches which he possessed, which God had given him more than that which he had need. Now, I will concede that there are, I believe, two ways to interpret this. You could omit that last sentence and just say, Abraham paid unto him tithes of all that he had, of all the riches which he possessed. And you could say, well, when it says, which God had given him more than that he had need, that it's just describing that all those riches and all that he had is more than he would need. It's just saying that he had a lot of stuff. You could look at it the other way and say that that's a kind of qualifier, that the things that Abraham are paying by way of tithing, all that he had, all the riches which he possessed, which God had given him more than that which he had need, is referring to the more than he needed. That Abraham was saying, hey, I've taken care of my massive posterity and I've got all these kids and blah, 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 right? We have what we need. God has given me more. Let me go tithe that of Melchizedek. And so I lean towards the latter interpretation, primarily because that's what modern revelation is here talking about. It's the surplus. Tithing is a surplus. Consecration is a surplus. Now, I don't think that there have been some church leaders in the past who have kind of said, you pay your tithing no matter what. You're poor, you don't have food, you can't pay rent, you can't survive. Pay tithing first. And I don't think that's supported, because living at a subsistence level would mean that you don't have well, okay, so let's get into this part, because we talked about verse 1 where it's about the surplus, and that's kind of when you newly come into the church. Well, what about those of us who've been members of the church for a long time? That's where we come to verse 4. I'll read it again and then we'll unpack it. And after that, meaning after the initial surplus, those who have been thus tithed, so consecration and tithing are being used kind of synonymously, those who have been thus tithed shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually. And this shall be a standing law unto them forever, for my holy priesthood, saith the Lord. All right, so here it's saying, after the initial surplus, we pay 1/10 of all of our interest annually. So the First Presidency, as I said earlier, in 1970 said, and I'll read this again to be accurate, they said, this is understood to mean income. Interest is understood to mean income. Understood by whom? Why? Is that true? Interest is understood to be income? Let's see what was actually understood a century and a half prior. At the time the revelation was given, 1828 dictionary again, let's look up the word interest. When God says you pay 1/10 of all of your interest, what does interest mean? 1828 dictionary. Here's a couple of the definitions of interest. Private profit. Any surplus advantage. There's that word surplus again as a definition of interest. Well, what does advantage mean? If interest means surplus advantage, does advantage mean something different? Here's the definition of advantage. Gain. Profit. Private profit was the definition of interest. The understanding at the time that this revelation was given, 1/10 of our interest annually, it was not paying rent and paying for the food you need to eat. It was profit. Think of like a business. In a business, you've got revenue, right? You're making a bunch of money. Should you pay tithing off of that income? I mean, you have to pay all your workers, you have to pay your lease, you have to pay insurance, you have to pay taxes, all these things just to even have the business exist. And none of that is profit. That's just revenue. Profit is what remains after all of those expenses, necessary expenses, are paid for. You can take some of the profit and, invest it or buy new, materials or expand the business. But those are options. That's like discretionary income. You get to decide what to do with this leftover money. That's your profit. Okay? It's a portion of your revenue. And so if we have a contrast between revenue and profit in a business context, I think the same contrast exists for you and I. It's the difference between what we understand to be income and interest, according to the 1828 dictionary. Right? If I have a job as a doctor and I'm making $200,000 a year, let's say, right? But I've got my mortgage and I've got the school loan that I have to pay back and I've got groceries and I've got, the car and all these things. My $200,000, if I'm paying taxes on my quote unquote income, as the modern church leaders have defined this as, using a modern definition of income. We'll talk about the old definition of income in just a moment. But if we use the modern definition of income and the modern interpretation of the law of tithing, which is pay 10% of your annual income, that doctor is paying 20 grand every year in tithing. But if you focus on what was understood at the time the revelation was giving, what I believe plainly the Lord implied, then that doctor would say, well, I got to pay these debts and I got to pay this more, all the things just to survive, to even have this income, right? He had to go to school, acquired the school debt, pay the rent. Now, look, if you're living in a lavish mansion, I don't think you can deduct those expenses from what you owe the Lord, right? I think it's a reasonable amount. And this is where the subjectivity comes in. This is why I think rightly the church isn't saying, here's the law, here's what you have to do, here's the exact interpretation. Because excuse me, I think there's a lot of nuance. I should really bring out a water when I do these. I think there's a lot of nuance. And so you can't say, oh, well, I got to pay this, $10,000 a month mortgage on this massive, I think that's unreasonable, right? I think there you're not doing the right thing. But just a reasonable, run-of-the-mill home, average middle class, whatever, nothing crazy, that is the expenses of your family business. You take your revenue, in this doctor's case, 200 grand, and you deduct the expenses to have that type of revenue generating activity. In his case, the school debt and the, reasonable mortgage and the food and whatnot, right? So then he takes out the expenses and then the leftover is the profit. And that is the definition of interest from Noah Webster, 1828, private profit. Any surplus advantage, which advantage means profit, any surplus profit. So God here in verse 4 is saying after your initial surplus, if you're new to the church, those who have been thus tithed with their initial surplus shall pay 1/10 of all their interest annually. This is why I think most of us are getting it wrong. Now, I will confess, right, that I've always just in the past paid, I've always paid on net, which I define as after taxes. Taxation is theft, and I find it ridiculous to pay tithing on taxes. Right? If I get a tax refund or whatever, I'll tithe on that because I actually see that money. But I've never found it right to pay tithing on gross. That just seems absurd. But the more I study this lately and the more I reflect on this, the more I think I'm getting it wrong. Not to say that giving the church more money is an inherently bad thing. It's not. But I think it's important to understand what's actually being required of us as a law. It's another thing to say, I'm a brown noser. Let me pay double to God. Hopefully I'll get more blessings, right? But I think it's important for us to say, what's actually required? What did God actually say? Not what do we think he said, not what did certain church leaders want to interpret it as, because maybe they want more money for the church so they can go do more things and fulfill their mission better or whatever. Some of those natural incentives perhaps to want to have more revenue coming in so that you can have bigger budgets for your departments and activities and so forth. But what does God actually say? And the crazy thing of it all is that, especially with consecration, we have all these separate commandments to go help the poor. So many people feel like paying their tithing is how they do that. Tithing does not go to help poor people, right? That's what fast offerings are for, and humanitarian aid and direct charity helping other people. Tithing is to build chapels and temples and the stipends of certain general authorities and keeping the lights on for the organization and funding all the bureaucracy and the staff and everyone else, right? It is the administration of the church. When I started a nonprofit in Utah a decade ago, it was crazy trying to fundraise among active Latter-day Saints because they're given 10% already. To get them to go from 10 to 11% is really hard, right? Because they check off the box, a lot of them, oh, I'm charitable. It's well, you're paying a membership fee. That's not charity. God has separate commandments to help the poor and give to the poor and share freely of our resources. Those commandments are not fulfilled on our part simply by paying our tithing. And I think there's a bit of a blurring of understanding here where a lot of saints feel like they can check that box by paying their tithing without realizing that that's not what tithing is actually about. And so here, I think then people living at a subsistence level are not required to pay tithing. This idea of paying God first no matter what, I think is wrong, because those individuals don't have profit. It's like a small business where you're not making any money. And there are a lot of those where there's revenue, maybe a small amount, maybe a medium amount, but there's no profit. I don't think, and I'm not the only one, many others have claimed this as well. Here's Orson Hyde in 1847. If it requires all a man can earn to support himself and his family, he is not tithed at all. And he's not the only one. There were other people that said this too, because again, there's no interest. If all of your time is going in just to like have bare subsistence and take care of what you need, you have no increase. There is no profit. There is no gain. Therefore, there is no interest in the understanding at the time of what the word interest meant. Okay, so then Joseph Smith dies, and it was like a few weeks later, the Quorum of the 12 issue their first kind of statement or proclamation. And this is, so far as I've been able to find, the first case in which the word income starts to come into the tithing lexicon, because before then it was interest. So here's this statement from the Quorum of the 12. Again, this is like right after Joseph dies. Everyone's kind of trying to figure out what's going on. And here's the Quorum of the 12 in this joint statement. They say, the temple must be completed by a regular system of tithing, according to the commandments of the Lord, which he has given as a law unto his church by the mouth of his servant Joseph. We're A-okay there. Here's D&C 119, right? Part of this is exactly what they just said. Laying on of the foundation of Zion for the building of mine house. It's verse 2. Here's what tithing is for. And here's the Quorum of the 12 saying, we got to build the temple, so we need tithing. It's from the revelation that Joseph gave as a law unto this church. A-okay, 100%. They continue. Therefore, as soon as the 12 have proceeded to a full and complete organization of the branches abroad, let every member proceed immediately to tithe himself or herself a tenth of all their property and money, and pay it into the hands of the 12, or into the hands of such bishops as have been or shall be appointed, blah, blah, blah. And then let them continue to pay a tenth of their income from that time forth. For this is a law unto the church, as much binding on their conscience as any other law or ordinance. All right. And there's a lot of other interesting, fun stuff. But here they say they make two changes. And they're not claiming this is a revelation. They're not claiming anything like that. In fact, they're leaning on the revelation of Joseph for support for this statement. They're saying, hey, Joseph revealed this and gave this law to the church, so you guys need to do this thing. Well, two things. Number one, immediately tithe him or herself a one-time infusion of cash, 1/10 of all of their property and money. This is a net worth tithe, similar to what Bishop Partridge had proposed a few years prior at 2%. Here they're saying a 10% of all of your property. That is not in D&C 119 at all. And okay, fine, one-time infusion, perhaps they can be forgiven because, they had to build the temple and whatever, right? They needed money. But then here they say, and then let them continue to pay a tenth of their income from that time forth, this standing law idea. 1/10 of their income. So in 1970, when the first presidency says, as they did, right, the scripture says 1/10 of their interest, which is understood to be income, that originated just weeks after Joseph died from the Quorum of the 12. And the word income has been tossed around here and there ever since then. All right, so let's pause then and look at the 1828 dictionary, because we know what income means. In our modern lexicon, income means like your salary, like all the money coming in. Your revenue, if you're a business, your family economy, it's your revenue. 1828 definition includes this: gain which proceeds from labor. Again, gain. Gain which proceeds from labor, business, or property. The proceeds of professional business, the profits of commerce. So even if we use the word income, it can be very safely argued that the 1828 definition was not all revenue, it was profits of commerce, gain which proceeds from labor, not compensation for labor. If I dig a ditch for you and you pay me $10, in this understanding, income was not $10. Income is whatever the gain is, which requires a subjective or kind of nuanced interpretation of what your time could on average produce, what your labor is worth, right? Because if I mean, think of it, let's do a trading example. Let's say I have a bunch of apples and I trade it to you for some eggs. Okay, so this is a barter economy. Not a lot of money, which early in these days, this was far more common, right? So I've got apples, you got eggs, and we trade. If we use the modern definition of tithing on income, then those eggs are income. I traded you, I now have new stuff, so I have to tithe 10% on the eggs. So then I take my 90% of eggs and I go trade it for some wool. And then I get that wool and I have to send 10% to the bishop's storehouse because that's income. It came into my net worth, or whatever, my budget. So now I have 90% of the wool, and then I trade that to Joe for lumber. And then I take 10% of the lumber and I tithe that. And then I take the lumber to Sally for butter. And then I tithe 10% of the butter. And then I need apples again, so I go trade for apples. And even though I've just traded value for value, like value in exchange, 5-6 steps down, I now have whatever, I'm not going to do the math, but let's say half of the apples that I had by the time I trade that same value all the way back to my originating asset, apples. That seems ridiculous. I'm trading like value, but I'm losing along the way. And that is, I think, the deficiency in the modern income definition. We're being taxed on overall revenue rather than on income. Because when I trade my time for something, it's, I think, no different in a lot of ways than trading an asset for an asset. There's an exchange, right? I might say like, hey, the market rate is $15 an hour. And so I'm going to trade my time. I could go do something else and earn $15 an hour, but I'll go hire myself out to dig a ditch. They're going to pay me $30 an hour. Well, because market rate of what I could go make otherwise is 15, but they're paying me 30. My gain, my what does it say? The profits of commerce, right? My gain is the 15 extra dollars per hour. So then I'll tithe the 10% on that. But all of this is implying that the word income is appropriate. That was not introduced until after Joseph died. Nowhere in the Revelation does it say income. It says interest. And interest has a specific definition. And income is slightly similar, but has enough wiggle room where you could start to say, well, gain which proceeds from labor. But again, my labor is worth something. There's that even exchange that happens, but then I can gain on top of that. Or especially as I start hiring people underneath me and they're bringing me extra money because I'm hiring out Bob for $15 or paying him $15 an hour, but I'm charging the client $50 an hour. So now I'm getting gain on top, right? All of that stuff gets tithed. It's all surplus. But it's not compensation for labor. It's gain which proceeds from labor. That is the 1828 definition of income. Gain which proceeds, gain, right? Surplus, which proceeds from labor. It's surplus, not the even exchange. But again, that's implying that the word income is appropriate. The next year, the Quorum of the 12 issues another statement in which they talk about the duty of all the saints to tithe themselves 1/10 of all they possess when they enter into the new and everlasting covenant, and 1/10 of their interest or income yearly afterward. So again, I don't know that God put that word income in there, even if they are related, even if, it's okay. Like the Revelation says interest, and I think that's where we leave it. Perhaps this fuzziness is why decades later, this is 1875, Brigham Young stands up in General Conference, and he's talking about tithing, and he said that neither himself nor anyone else had ever paid their tithing as it was revealed and understood by God in the Doctrine and Covenants. Huh? Here's Brigham Young saying no one's paid tithing as God actually revealed it and understood it at the time it was given. So my title, provocative though it may be, or my contention that none of us are paying tithing right, was supported by Brigham Young himself. Perhaps because the Quorum of the 12 was starting to introduce this income idea and everyone starts paying more money, which means that a lot of people struggled. Early saints, a lot of them didn't pay tithing. And so church leaders all the time were having to how do we get them to pay? How do we get them to pay? Let's go out and give this talk. Let's dangle the carrot. Let's talk about the blessings. Let's remind everyone of their duty. Because many saints were struggling and they were in poverty, and to pay 1/10 of their net worth and then 1/10 of all of their earnings was a huge hardship for a lot of people. And maybe it's not a hardship today, but I think it also deprives people of that discretionary income that they can use to better fulfill the persistent commandment to help the poor. Like if you're thinking in your mind what that mental math is of if I were to only pay 1/10 of my actual, profit or surplus, then, maybe let's say it's half. Let's say you just cut in half your tithing budget should you choose to agree with and act upon these things, which I haven't even done yet. This is Connor learning and musing and starting to think maybe I need to, the way I've been doing it is all different. And again, I have a wife and we get to have a conversation, and I'm sure you do as well. But if you're doing that mental math and you're like, well, wait a minute, now my tithing budget just got cut in half. I think the wrong way to look at that is, let's go to Disneyland, right? I think a better way to do that is let's redirect the rest of that to fast offerings, or to the humanitarian aid fund, or as discretionary income that we will use to fund every GoFundMe that we come across on Facebook. A friend is in need, we'll pitch in $100 or, whatever, right? I think the wrong way to think of this is personal gain. I think the better way to look at this is paying tithing properly can better enable us to have discretionary income with which we can obey the commandment to help the poor. And maybe then we will be living the law of tithing as God intended, because according to Brigham Young, 30, 40 years into it, no one at the time was. Well, what about Malachi, right? The Lord will pour out these blessings and you won't even I'm only going to touch on this briefly, but the point is when you look at Malachi, those few verses, right? Wherein have you robbed God? You have robbed me because you've not, tithed, and prove me now herewith if I will not, right? And the scriptures share it all the time. But what's the context of Malachi? He's talking to corrupt priests. When you look at chapter 1 and 2, he's castigating all of these priests. I mean, verses 8 and 9 specifically are all about the corruption of these priests and what they're doing to complain, and they are robbing, stealing offerings. They're doing really crappy offerings. Here's Malachi 2, 8 and 9. But you're departed out of the way. You've caused many to stumble at the law. You've corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore have I made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as you've not kept my ways, but have been partial in the law. So here's Malachi, he's castigating all the religious leaders, and then because they're the ones receiving all the tithes and offerings, and they're likely taking some and keeping some, for themselves and starting to build up a little whatever. And so then you get into chapter 3, and I think a plausible argument can be made that the audience for chapter 3 is not the lay members of the church and this everyone, you need to be paying your tithing. It's the church leaders and what they're doing with the tithing. Puts a whole different light on Malachi 3 when you focus first on chapters 1 and 2 and say, maybe this is about proper administration of all of that money, which leads me to my final point. This is a controversial topic for some, but I believe that the church needs to be totally transparent with its finances. Now, it's not my tithing. I am commanded to pay my tithes. It's God's. It's for God's kingdom. But it is not for church leaders. I'm not paying this so Russell and Nelson will be happy with me. I'm not doing it for anyone else. I'm doing it for God. So the church's finances were published for a long time. They were transparent for a very long time. But I think why this matters so much is that it boils down to consent. President Hinckley was interviewed in 2002, so 20 years ago, by a reporter who was talking about how, look in all these European countries where they have these transparency laws and they have to publish budgets and all these things. Why is it impossible for your church, he said, the reporter, to do the same? And President Hinckley said, and I quote, "We simply think that that information belongs to those who made the contribution and not the world. What does that mean? Right? He's saying perhaps and likely that we don't want to publish it on the internet, or we don't want our enemies to be able to see it, and we don't want the world to see it. We want just our members to see it. But you can't really publish it to the members without the broader world seeing it. And they weren't at the time, and for a long time were not publishing it to the members. You've never seen in recent decades a church report on how all these funds are being used. Go back to D&C 119. There are very specific use cases authorized for tithing. And so then you go into D&C 104. This is in verse 71. It says, and this is talking about the church's treasury. So all this money. And there shall not any part of it be used or taken out of the treasury, only by the voice and common consent of order. Common consent, right? Section 26, verse 2, all things shall be done by common consent in the church. Any institution of corruptible, fallible people can degrade, can have problems, can have problematic people within, embezzling money, using money properly. You can have fiefdoms and bureaucracies trying to hoard more money here and do things there. This is not anything I'm referring even to our church in general. This is human nature, right? Sunlight, as they say, who was that? Oliver Wendell Holmes or Frederick Douglass or someone. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And it's not just that I have this random opinion that the church's financial report should be public. It's that I don't believe you can have common consent without having informed consent. I mean, imagine like this today in sacrament meeting, there were a bunch of people who got callings in my ward. Imagine if instead they said, oh, we're calling 8 new people to be, teaching in the primary. All who are okay with that, raise your hand. Oh, yeah, okay. And, probably everyone would raise their hand and move on because we're sheep or whatever, right? And so we might say, oh, but we gave consent. I raised my hand. I said that was okay to call 8 new people to work in the nursery. Well, if we don't know who they are, what if I have knowledge that Brother Bob has a history of molesting little girls, right? Maybe he was a sex offender. Maybe he had a child pornography problem that I was aware of. Maybe something I know that would give me an opportunity. If I knew that he was being called to work with the youth, I could say I object to that one. I'd like to have a conversation with the bishop. But if I'm not informed about who's in that calling, I can't properly consent or dissent. Because again, you can't give consent if you can't also dissent. You have to be able to dissent in order to consent. But you can really do neither unless you're informed. And so President Hinckley, when he's saying, oh, it's just for our members of the church, my hunch is that he's referring to the, annual audit that's performed, and we just trust the auditor who's an employee of the church. And he says, everything's by the books. Don't you worry, guys. And we, all raise our hand. I think we do, right? Doesn't he? They present it for sustaining vote, right? And so the guy gets up, and it's this dry auditor, financial guy, and he reads the same letter every year. And it's like the terms and conditions when you download software, right? No one reads it. You just agree. And you hit agree, and but at least you have access to it. And some people do read those, and lawyers can scan all that, and they can pick it apart, and they can analyze it and talk about it, or, at least the information is there. Whether you want to go study it or not is up to you, but you're at least presented the opportunity to be informed. And I think it is wrong where the Doctrine and Covenants require that all expenditures of the treasury, and frankly, all things, as it says in section 26, shall be done by common consent. Common consent has to be informed, and that includes the finances of the church. It's not enough to say we should just trust the leaders, because that's not what the church is about. It's not just about trusting the leaders. If anything, you could argue in the inverse. You should say the members should be trusted, right? Because the church is not the church of the quorum of the 12. It's not the church of the first presidency. It's not, I guess legally it's the corporation soul of the presiding, the president of the church. And anyways, there's a lot of history there with the polygamy and all the kind of the dissolution of the church and everything else. But the point is, theologically, scripturally, this isn't the leader's church. It is our church. We are all kind of, appendages and whatnot. And It's our church, it's God's church. I believe transparency is required, and I think that is something that needs to change. This isn't my hill to die on. I'm not, I know there have been petitions in the past, and there was like some BYU professor who made the news. I think he was starting a petition or something some months or a year or two ago talking about this or whatever. But I just think, like, how in the world are you supposed to have common consent at the church if the members are not informed in their vote? We all have a vote. I mean, it's kind of a big democracy in a lot of ways. There was a part in the early church when Joseph, and I think it was Sidney Rigdon, they're out working all the time, and they're administering affairs, helping the immigrants, setting up, banks and businesses and all the things to administer the affairs of the church. And they got no time for their own job. So they go to the High Council, and the High Council says, hey, we're going to vote to give you a stipend, not for preaching, because we don't want priestcraft, but just for all your time, because we want you focused on church administration. So I believe this is the first time that a kind of stipend for general authorities, quote unquote, was introduced. And it was something like like 3x of what the average like daily wage was. Like, it was some healthy, thing, budget. And the church leaders, church members vetoed it. And instead they were given some land, to like build on and just have some property. But the church was able to do that and even restrict the High Council and the friggin' founding prophet of the church, right? Who had this kind of slush fund or this generous salary, and church members stood up through their vote of common consent and said, we don't think that's appropriate. So again, this isn't just follow your leaders, trust whatever they say, everything's a-okay, authoritarian, top-down, bureaucratic approach. It's supposed to be quite the opposite. We are supposed to consent, and we can't do that if we don't know. End rant. Okay, so tithing, I think, is so much different than what we talk about. The modern definition of income, of course, is just salary. And so when the church handbook and when church leaders and the first presidency in 1970 and everyone just says interest, which means income, hardly anyone, like literally almost no one, is going to look up, what does that interest word mean? Who's cracking open the 1828 dictionary? Instead, we breeze past it. It's like reading Isaiah, right? Who's sitting down with like their interpretations and trying to like pick out all the little words and understand? Like, no one does. That's not how we in the church study scriptures. We just gloss over what we don't know, and then, scripture mastery, I know this one, right? And okay, and I'm moving on, right? And I think this cursory kind of skimming through the scriptures deprives us of the context and what is actually right. So if we focus on that word interest, we come away with a very different lesson, because instead, when the interpretations, the case law, cakes on this word income, as the Quorum of the 12 did, then the modern definition of income gets used, and then everyone goes on their merry way thinking that they have to pay 1/10 of all money that they earn. And then the whole debate again becomes about, well, do I pay before taxes or after taxes? But it's implied, or it's assumed, that all you have to do is pay on everything you earn and keep it at that, when that's not in fact what the scriptures say. So I think with all scriptures, not just this, I mean, I did one on the word of wisdom. If you haven't gone back to that musing, go have some fun with that one, right? Similarly, like, if you read what the scriptures are actually saying, if you use that 1828 dictionary and try and suss out the definitions of these words at the time they were given, as the early church understood them, and not as we understand those words today, you're going to have, I think, a far richer understanding of the gospel and get closer to understanding what God wanted us and wants us presently to think, believe, and do. I prefer a gospel that's accurate, that we go and read the text and not the interpretations and the case law. And that's why I would hate going to law school. I would sit in con law and just like complain the whole time. Can we actually read what the Constitution says rather than what the judges and the case law have said? And it's why I'm so critical of the Pharisees. Like, read the Bible, right? Don't just have all these interpretations on top. So similarly with stuff like this, I think reading D&C 119, using the dictionary, do your own study. Like, again, I've been looking at this for myself, and it's been a fascinating journey, but I do come to the conclusion that the modern interpretation that the church continues to promote, using the word income without context, and also allowed to continue this misunderstanding and this misinterpretation, I think it's wrong. And, ultimately, people who run an organization want people. I mean, I run a nonprofit. I would love for people to pay me, twice as much as they do. That would help me fulfill my mission, a good mission, right? What we do is important. And I would love for people to just double their investment in our work. So even in a church, right? It's a different kind of nonprofit run by humans that have their biases and, fallibilities and mistakes and whatnot. And so I'm sure there are people in the church who are okay with that misunderstanding being so prevalent, because it means the church gets a lot more resources to do its very important work. But maybe some of that money that we are all spending needs to be reallocated to directly help the poor, which is a separate commandment that I think a lot of us don't do very well at all, and arguably is a more important commandment than tithing. If you get in, start reading your Hugh Nibley and some of this stuff, right? I think there's a lot more gravity around how we treat poor people than whether we're funding the administration of the church. So we'll leave it there. Have fun with that conversation with your spouse or your parents or your whoever that you're now get to go talk to about whether you're paying too much in tithing. Ongoing conversation in our household, but an important one, if for nothing else than having the exercise of trying to better understand what God has said. Wherever you land, whatever you decide, I think that journey, that experience is worth it. It's been worth it for me to really try and get closer to that original understanding, and I think we ought to do more of it. So we'll leave it there. Have an awesome Sunday, and we will see you guys on the next musing.